I once believed the Civil War was a noble affair, rows of gallant men, banners flapping in the wind, officers leading heroic charges under a righteous sun. But those romantic portraits are lies, or at best illusions, painted by those who never felt the true weight of the war. I stood in the midst of it, and what I saw was not gallantry, but a slaughterhouse. It was a meat grinder that would have swallowed you whole as it nearly did me. The war I lived through offered the worst of both worlds, crude, almost medieval medical care on one side, and modern industrial killing machines on the other. Over 620,000 of my fellow Americans never made it home, a number that today would be the equivalent of 6 million. That's not just a statistic. It's a tidal wave of lives extinguished one breath at a time. Walt Whitman, who served beside us as a nurse, wrote that the real war would never make it into the books. He was right. What happened behind the gunfire after the smoke settled, that's something words often fail to capture. In 1861, the battlefields I marched across were unlike anything the world had seen, old-fashioned Napoleonic strategies thrown headlong into the path of brutal mechanized weapons that tore through flesh and bone without mercy. I remember standing shoulder to shoulder with the other men, packed so tightly we could barely lift our arms. When the command came, we moved as one, a wall of wool and willpower marching straight into the teeth of fire. We were trained to keep formation, to trust the line, but no drill could prepare you for what it felt like when the mini-balls started flying. Those bullets, conical things, cursed inventions, tore through us like thunderbolts. They didn't just pass through a body. They expanded on impact, exploded bones into fragments, and pushed dirty cloth and splinters deep into the wounds. I saw men whose limbs were reduced to pulp, whose wounds were so grotesque you couldn't tell where skin ended and clothing began. If a modern surgeon had been dropped into our world, I think they would have turned and run. I was at Gettysburg, I walked that field, and I can still see in my mind the place where they later counted over 27,000 bullets in a single acre. You can't imagine that unless you were there. Every tree looked clawed open. The air itself seemed to buzz with death. One Confederate surgeon, Julian Chisholm, said he'd never seen such mangled flesh, and neither had I. At Shiloh, the sound of bullets was constant drumming on our canteens and cartridge boxes, like hail on a tin roof. Men dropped around me in mid-stride, some with no more than a grunt, others screaming, until their voices gave out. The noise, the horror, the utter chaos that was our reality. I saw what those mini-balls could do. When they struck a man's arm or leg, they didn't just snap the bone, they shattered it, pulverized it into fragments like broken glass. There was no setting a limb like that. The flesh would swell, the bone would rot, and the only thing that stood between a man and a slow septic death was the surgeon's saw. I watched friends of mine lose arms and legs in the dirt, screaming into bloodied rags or biting down on sticks to keep from losing their minds. Sometimes they didn't make it through the operation at all. I remember what Private William Ostrander once said, that the sound of bullets hitting men was like throwing a handful of corn against a barn door. He wasn't exaggerating. It was sickening, a wet, hollow slap that echoed through your ribs and made your stomach turn. And if you think surgery offered salvation, think again. Our hospitals, if you could even call them that, were horrors unto themselves. At Antietam, I stepped into one of the field tents where Union surgeon Jonathan Letterman was working, and I've never been the same since. The wounded were everywhere, covering the ground like debris after a storm. They moaned, bled, begged, and the surgeons moved like machines, fast, relentless, barely pausing to wipe their blades before moving to the next poor soul. It wasn't about care. It was about numbers. Too many wounded, not enough time. You cut, you tied off, you moved on. If the man lived, it was a miracle. If he died, well, there were always more coming. I remember stepping over bodies to reach the surgeon's tent. The ground outside was littered with wounded men, groaning, bleeding, begging for relief. The air was thick with the stench of blood sweat, and something else I can only call despair. The wounds were unspeakable, jagged holes, where limbs had been faces, half-gone bellies, ripped open like sacks of grain. The surgeons worked in a frenzy, moving down the line, like butchers at a slaughterhouse, their hands sticky with old blood, their instruments dull from overuse. They had no time to wash between patients. I don't blame them, there were just too many of us. At Gettysburg, I watched one surgeon perform over 70 amputations in a single day. 70. I can still see his face, hollow-eyed, mechanical, like he wasn't even present in his own body anymore. Most of us didn't get anesthesia. If you were lucky, someone shoved a whiskey bottle in your mouth or splashed you with chloroform, but more often, it was just a couple of men holding your shoulders down while the saw cut through bone. The screams. God, the screams. They don't leave you. I've heard animals die quieter. Mary Chestnut, a woman who visited one of our hospitals in Richmond, once wrote that the surgeons were sawing off arms and legs as fast as they could, and she wasn't wrong. That was our reality. And if you think that was the worst of it, you've never been in close combat. At Cold Harbor, we fought with everything we had: bayonets, rifle butts, fists, even rocks. I saw men stab each other so close their faces were nearly touching. Sometimes when your musket was spent and your hands were shaking too hard to reload, all you had left was your rage and your fingernails. It wasn't battle, it was slaughter, up close and personal. I can still feel the way the stock of my musket splintered in my hands from striking bone. We fought them with clubbed weapons when we couldn't reload fast enough. And when they got even closer, when the smoke thickened and your breath came ragged, we fought with our fists, our teeth, even our bare hands. I once wrapped my fingers around a man's throat because there was nothing else left. His eyes locked with mine. I still dream about them, in the wilderness. God help us, the trees were so thick we couldn't see the enemy until they were nearly on top of us. You could hear them breathing before you saw them. The underbrush caught fire from the musket flashes, and men burned alive, screaming in a green inferno. Colonel Wainwright called it a street fight, and he was right. There were no battle lines, no formations, just chaos in the thicket, where friends and enemies vanished in smoke and screams. I'll tell you this, most of us would have rather been shot than stabbed. There was something monstrous about the bayonet. A ball might kill you quickly, but a blade, it lingered, twisted, tore. Many men didn't scream because they couldn't. They were too shocked by the pain. And even if you lived through the stabbing, that wasn't the end. Infection was waiting, always waiting. Without any real medicine, even a scratch could rot. I saw friends die from wounds that wouldn't draw a second glance today, a scraped knuckle, a shallow slice. But then it would swell, blacken, and the fever would take them. We feared the wound less than what came after it. I remember hearing about General Reynolds, a brave man struck down at Gettysburg by what would barely warrant a bandage today. But back then, even a small wound could become a death sentence. It wasn't just the bullets you had to fear, it was what came after in the quiet, fevered hours. We all dreaded the black rot. Gangrene. You'd smell it before you saw it. A sweet, sickly stench that clung to everything, to canvas, to uniforms, to the very air. It was the smell of death, slow and certain. Clara Barton once said you could catch the scent from outside the tent. She wasn't lying. I'd pass by the hospital rows and gag at the odor, knowing that inside men were rotting while still alive. We didn't need doctors to tell us when it had set in. The smell did that. Once it took hold, there was only one thing to do: cut. Fast and high. If the rot was in your hand, they'd take your arm. If it was in your foot, they'd cut at the thigh. There was no room for half measures. You had to get ahead of the poison, or it would chase you straight into the grave. Dr. Hunter McGuire, who tended Stonewall Jackson himself, said the smell of gangrene hung over the tents like a funeral cloth. And he was right. It followed us everywhere, a shroud we wore long before we were dead. Not all wounds bled. Some buried themselves deep where no surgeon's knife could reach. I still carry them. I saw men torn apart beside me, not metaphorically, not in passing. Torn apart. Limbs flung across fields like discarded tools, faces obliterated, bodies in pieces so grotesque you could no longer tell they had once been someone's son, someone's friend. After a fight, we'd walk the field picking up the parts, not all of them whole, not all of them human anymore, and try to match them to names, to uniforms, to memories. I remember what Lieutenant Galway said after Gettysburg. The sight was horrible. That was the only word he needed. I saw limbless trunks gasping like fish heads with no bodies, and bodies with no heads. The silence after battle was louder than the cannons had ever been. Just the wind, the crows, and the dead. And we knew, all of us, that we were only ever inches away from joining them. We lived with that awareness every waking moment, and even when we managed sleep, it followed us into dreams. I wrote letters to my family with hands still trembling from the fight, trying to sound brave. I remember reading Sullivan Ballew's letter, the way he spoke to his wife, promising to be with her even in death. I understood that. I felt that. Every man did, because in the end, we all knew we were writing from the edge of the world, speaking across a line we might not get to cross back. Not every death came face to face. Sometimes you didn't even see it coming. At Fredericksburg, I watched men march straight into the jaws of hell. We advanced over open ground, with no cover but the packs on our backs and the prayers on our lips. The Confederate guns waited for us at Mary's Heights, and when they opened up, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. General Longstreet said even a chicken couldn't survive that field. He was right. I don't know how I did. Artillery doesn't just kill, it erases. Case-shot canister, they shredded men where they stood, turned whole lines into red mist. 1 second a man was next to me yelling, breathing alive, and the next, there was nothing left of him but blood and a boot. At Antietam, the ground was soaked with so much gore we called it the slaughter pen. I walked through it afterward. I'll never forget the smell, or the silence. There were so many bodies you couldn't tell who was who. Arms without shoulders, heads without names. We started pinning bits of paper to our coats, hoping that if we fell, someone might at least send word home. That's when they began using dog tags because too many mothers were burying strangers. I remember hearing about a farmer after Gettysburg who found his field so full of arms, legs, and torsos that he gave up trying to match them. He just gathered the pieces in a sack and buried what he could. That was what the war did to us. It didn't just kill us, it unmade us. Survival wasn't always a blessing. I lived through my wounds, but what came after felt like a different kind of sentence. The war didn't end when the fighting stopped. Not for me, not for any of us who came home missing a piece of ourselves. I've seen men like Private Alfred Ballard hobble through life with one leg and a splintering wooden stump, the skin beneath it raw, blistered, never healing. We had no real prosthetics, just carved timber strapped to ruined flesh. I knew men who dragged themselves across rooms on their elbows, too broken to stand, too proud to beg. And the ones who kept all their limbs, many of them weren't any luckier. I knew one fellow who took a piece of shrapnel to the belly. It never killed him, but he spent the rest of his life fighting off fevers and gut pain that no doctor could fix. We just called it the wound, as if that one word carried the whole weight of it. Even heroes like Richard Kirkland, they called him the Angel of Mary's Heights. For the water he gave to wounded Yankees, even he couldn't escape the pain. He lived but barely. The war left him riddled with it pain that wore him down year by year until it finally took him. You see, the Civil War didn't just end lives. It broke bodies and left them that way with no hope of repair, no rehabilitation, no mercy. We were expected to come home, shake off the horrors, and carry on like we hadn't left parts of ourselves behind. 1 in 5. That's how many Southern boys never came home. In the North, the toll was just a shade better, but no less tragic. These weren't numbers to us. They were names we called across the campfire voices we sang with on picket duty hands that passed the hardtack down the line. And when they died, they didn't die easy. The war didn't allow that. We all knew what it looked like to die slowly in a muddy field hospital, screaming and alone, soaked in sweat and filth. That's why some of us carried little white pills tucked into our shirts, a last resort. Cyanide morphine, whatever we could scrounge. Not because we were cowards. No, because we knew what a slow death looked like and we didn't want that ending. Better to choose it ourselves if it came to that. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who survived more wounds than any man ought to once said our hearts were touched with fire. He was right. We burned with a kind of fever no doctor could treat, the fever of knowing we'd already seen too much. Before every battle, I'd pin a scrap of paper to the inside of my coat name regiment, home county. Not because I thought it would save me, but because I didn't want to vanish nameless in a trench. I wanted someone to tell my mother. I wanted a grave, even if it was shallow. I'll never forget this boy they found at Gettysburg, stiff and cold, with a note pinned to his chest. Dear Father, forgive me for running away to join the army. I hope I've made you proud. God help me, I hope someone sent that letter home. That note pinned to that boy's coat, it said everything we were all too afraid to speak aloud. We went into battle, not just expecting to die, but to die badly, slowly, in agony, with no dignity, no comfort, no final words. It wasn't bravery, it was resignation, a quiet understanding that this war had no mercy left to give. President Lincoln once said the prayers of both could not be answered. I think of that often. We prayed God, did we pray, but no answers ever came. Not when the hunger set in, not when the fever started, not when the flesh turned black. Bullets and bayonets weren't our only killers. Hunger crept into our bellies and made us hollow. Pestilence settled into our lungs and left us coughing up blood. The world itself seemed poisoned, the trees, the water, the very air. People think of the Civil War as glory and flags and noble sacrifice. I remember the stomach growling so loud I couldn't sleep. I remember the smell of rot in the camps. I remember whole villages stripped bare, every fence post burned for firewood, every cupboard empty, every field trampled under boot and hoof. The romanticism died quickly. John S. Wise, a Confederate like me, once said that death by glory was better than death by starvation or sickness. And he was right. At least in battle you could stand. You could fight. But when disease got you, when the hunger set in, you just faded. You stopped being a soldier. You became a ghost that hadn't yet died. You want to know what survival tasted like? It tasted like hardtack, that miserable rock-hard cracker we called food. You couldn't bite it without risking a broken tooth, and if it didn't break your jaw, it might just crawl off your plate. I can't count how many times I cracked one open only to find it squirming inside with weevils or maggots. By then, you just sighed and brushed them off. Hunger didn't leave room for disgust. At Petersburg, I served near the boys from the 14th Connecticut, and I'll never forget the day they started betting on worm races. That's how far we'd fallen laughing at crawling insects, because it beat crying about them. Someone joked their crackers could march better than we could, probably right too, since they had more legs and more energy than we did. I developed a trick. I'd pour coffee over my hardtack, just to draw out the worms. They'd float to the top like tiny gray buoys, and I'd skim them off with a spoon. Not that it mattered much. The water was foul anyway, and the coffee was more mud than brew. Sometimes we'd joke it was extra protein. Animated hardtack, we called it. We told ourselves it was good for us. Lied to ourselves, really. Because what else could we do? You either learned to eat filth and laugh about it, or you wasted away. Salt pork was supposed to be a staple, something solid we could count on. But more often than not, it came to us spoiled, already half rotten, by the time we opened the barrels. I remember at Fredericksburg, some of the Union boys were tossing theirs straight into the fires, not to cook, but to burn. The grease caught like lamp oil, proving it was better fuel than food. We had a ritual for it. Slice away the green and black patches, scrape off the slime, and hope to find a sliver of something you could force down. It didn't always work. You'd chew a piece and gag, then spit it into the dirt and wonder what else you could eat. I'll never forget when we seized that Union supply train near Cold Harbor. We cracked open barrels of pork like children tearing into presents, and then recoiled. The smell alone could knock a man over. We were starving, but not even hunger could overcome the rot. I heard one of our boys mutter, "We ate our shoes last week, maybe mule meat's next." At Vicksburg, it wasn't a joke. We actually did eat mules. Some men dug rats out of walls and roasted them over fires. Others soaked shoe leather in water, boiled it soft, and chewed it like gristle. I tried it myself once, a slice of saddle strap boiled until it was more broth than anything else. It tasted like ash and desperation, but it kept the belly from cramping. We stopped caring what it was as long as it stayed down. Survival had no taste. I lived through the hunger, not just passing emptiness, but the kind of hunger that gnawed at your bones, that made you dizzy in the morning and hollow at night. During the siege, I remember hearing that mule meat was going for $1 a pound. $1 not in gold, but in the worthless Confederate paper that lined our boots when the soles gave out. Rats, they were more valuable than silver. A clean one was a prize. We joked about recipes, but the truth wasn't funny. By '63, we were lucky to get a quarter pound of meat on the best of days, and many days there was nothing. The blockade runners tried their best, but they couldn't bring in enough, not when whole armies were starving and whole cities were crumbling. Every road that once brought food now brought only dust and silence. And then Sherman came. His march carved a wound across Georgia 60 miles wide and miles deep. His men didn't just march, they consumed. Every barn, every granary, every field burned or looted. If they couldn't eat it, they destroyed it. Private Charland from Sherman's army said it best, "We destroyed everything we could not eat." And they did. I walked behind their path once. The land looked like it had been cursed. We said even the crows had to carry their own rations to fly over what Sherman left behind. That wasn't a jest, that was our truth. We lived in a world stripped bare. They said the land behind us looked like a desert, and they weren't lying. After Sherman passed through, there was nothing left. Not a crop, not a rail, not even a fence post. I heard an old farmer say even the crows had to bring their own food just to cross it. He wasn't wrong. It was desolation. Sherman didn't pretend otherwise. War is cruelty, he said, and the crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. That was his logic, and it showed. His men tore up over 300 miles of railroad, twisted the rails around trees like vines, we called them, Sherman's neckties. They burned towns, scattered livestock, salted earth. It wasn't just war, it was punishment. And the civilians, they suffered more than any of us in uniform. In Atlanta, even before Sherman arrived, you couldn't buy a barrel of flour for less than 1,000 Confederate dollars. That kind of money might have bought a house before the war. Now it barely bought crumbs. I remember what Mary Chestnut wrote, how women brewed coffee from scorched corn and made tea from blackberry leaves just to hold on to something warm, something human. We're learning to live without everything, she said, except bread, and not much of that. In Richmond, we saw the hunger turn to fury. In the spring of '63, food riots broke out, mostly women, desperate, angry, starving. They stormed the markets and bakeries. President Davis himself had to step out and face the mob. I heard he threw coins at them, coins, and then warned the soldiers would fire if they didn't disperse. That was how far we'd fallen, reduced to begging, burning, and bartering for crumbs. The war was no longer about victories. It was about surviving another day. I remember the price of butter better than I remember my own pay. $27, Confederate dollars, of course, for a single pound. That was more than a man could earn in a week, and we weren't even talking gold or silver, just faded ink on paper that meant nothing outside the South. People were starving, and not quietly. They rioted in Richmond, mostly women screaming, shoving, throwing rocks for bread. I wasn't there that day, but I heard Jefferson Davis himself came out to face them, tossed coins into the crowd like they were dogs, and told them to go home or else the soldiers would open fire. Imagine that our president threatening to shoot mothers over loaves of bread. But if hunger didn't get you, disease probably would. The camps. Lord, the camps were hell in canvas. Men packed in so tight we could barely lie flat, living and dying within arm's reach of one another. The latrines overflowed. The water was foul. You couldn't walk a dozen steps without stepping in something you didn't want to look at. At Camp Douglas up north in Chicago, our boys were packed into freezing wooden barracks and damp earth pits, so many bodies, so little air. They called it the North's Andersonville. Disease ran rampant. You could feel it in the air, hear it in the coughs, smell it in every breath you took. The stench was so thick you could smell the camp before you saw it. Some said the wind carried our sickness for miles. I believe it. I lived in that stink and I still catch it in my dreams. General Butler once said he could track our movements by the stench hanging over our camps. That wasn't hyperbole, that was truth. The air itself betrayed us. The rot, the sweat, the sickness, it followed us like a curse. But if our camps were bad, then Andersonville was a nightmare carved out of the earth itself. I was there. I remember it too well. They say 100 men died there every day, and I believe it. We didn't need guns or guards to keep us down. We were dying faster than they could count. Dysentery, typhoid fever, they swept through us like wind through dry grass. In the mornings, we'd wake up and find the dead still sitting where they'd lain the night before, eyes open, jaws slack. Some died sitting up, some curled against others like children. There was no room to lie flat. You shifted someone aside just to make space for your own ribs to touch the ground. And the water. God, the water. There was only one stream in that place, and we all drank from it. We also used it to wash and to relieve ourselves because there was nowhere else. That foul ribbon of disease ran through the camp like a poisoned vein. I watched men crawl to it on shaking limbs, scoop a handful drink, and die a few days later, with their stomachs rotting from the inside out. You didn't live at Andersonville. You simply tried not to die. We called it camp fever, but it was typhoid, and it was ruthless. It killed more of us than bullets ever did, especially in the early years when we still thought the war might be short. It swept through tents and barracks like smoke, quiet, at first, a cough, here a man slumping during roll call, and then suddenly it was everywhere. I was there during the Peninsular Campaign in '62, when over 5,000 men caught it in a single month. 5,000. Entire companies were reduced to coughing skeletons. I remember watching our numbers shrink day by day, not from battle, but from beds soaked with fever sweat. Private Christie from Minnesota got it right when he described the march of that sickness. First came the fever and the bone-deep ache. Then came the bloody flux, your insides turning to water, your strength leaking out with every step. If you somehow made it through, that the pneumonia would finish what the fever started. It didn't matter how strong you'd been. Typhoid stripped everyone down to the same pale, shivering mess. At Shiloh, it hit us so hard that Grant nearly lost the whole fight before it even started. We were too weak to load rifles. Some of the boys couldn't even lift their heads. It wasn't the Confederates we were losing to that week. It was our own bowels, our own breath, our own broken bodies. And the worst part? We didn't even know how it spread. We were dying in filth, and none of us understood why. Surviving typhoid didn't mean you'd won. Most of us who pulled through were never the same. Weakness settled in your bones like winter cold, permanent bone deep. We got wind that even General McClellan had been brought low by it, laid up for weeks. If a man like that, with all his rank and resources, could be crippled by fever, what chance did we have? The truth is, our doctors were flying blind. Nobody really understood disease, not how it spread, not how to stop it. We thought bad air caused it, or maybe the damp. But it wasn't the fog or the chill that killed us. It was filth, our own hands, our own habits. Clara Barton, bless that woman, worked among us at Armory Square. She said it plain for every one of us who died to a bullet. 2 more died rotting away in bed. And she was right. The war was being fought not just on the battlefield, but in the wards, in the shadows, in the lungs and bellies of men too weak to fight back. Doctors meant well, but they didn't know. They moved from cot to cot with the same bloody hands, the same unwashed tools. They spread sickness like fire through dry grass, and no one thought to stop them. Dr. Letterman, who tried to change things once, said, "We lost more men to invisible enemies than to bullets." I lived through it, and I'll never forget how true that was. The enemy wasn't always the man across the field. Sometimes it was already inside you. I was in Washington when the smallpox outbreak hit in '62. Folks panicked, and with good reason. The doctors tried to fight it with vaccines. Primitive things scraped from sores and scratched into the skin with crude tools. But more than once, the so-called cure ended up killing more men than the disease. I remember hearing Surgeon Tripler say that the treatment itself became a death sentence. At Camp Nelson, I met a survivor from the United States Colored Troops, the only one from his regiment who lived. The vaccine they got was tainted bad from the start. One by one, his comrades broke out in fever and sores. Then silence. He said he watched them die and rose powerless to help. It wasn't the Confederates who killed them. It was a needle and some bad luck. And then there was the land itself, poisoned, fouled, ruined by the weight of war. I passed through Gettysburg not long after the battle. The stench hit you before the hills even came into view. Over 7,000 horses and mules lay rotting in the fields, blackened, bloated, crawling with flies. Their bodies spilled into streams, their fluids soaked into wells. We drank it anyway. What choice did we have? Unburied men lay where they'd fallen. Rain washed over them, through them into our water and our skin. Our camps were little more than cesspools, dirt, blood, manure, and bodies stacked too deep to count. We breathed that in. We lived in it. It wasn't just war we were fighting. It was rot and ruin and death in the very ground beneath our feet. I'll never forget the smell after Gettysburg. No one who was there could. It wasn't just strong, it was alive. It wrapped around you and crept into your nose and clung to your skin like a second coat. I met a farmer named Samuel McCreary, kind man, who told me the stench was so awful it woke his family in the middle of the night, 30 miles away. And still it reached them. Lieutenant Haskell wrote in his diary that the air was heavy with 1,000 putrefactions. He was right. That word putrefaction, it stayed with me. It wasn't just death. It was decay. Thick, wet, and choking. I wish I could forget that smell too, but it lingers. Even now, sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I swear I catch a hint of it. The land itself seemed to remember what had happened. Farmers told us their cattle wouldn't drink from the streams, not even months later. They'd sniff the water and back away like it was poison, and maybe it was. The ground was soaked with the blood of men and animals alike, the bodies buried shallow or not at all. Rain came, and all of it, every secret, every rot, seeped down into the soil. Next spring, nothing grew. I walked through fields that had once been green and thick with wheat, and now they lay silent, barren. We thought we were just fighting each other, but it turns out we were killing the land too. And the land, like us, didn't forget. Cleanliness, that was a joke, a cruel one. In the camps, we didn't bathe. Not because we didn't want to, but because there was no water to spare. And even if there was, it was usually fouled with blood, or manure, or worse. We wore the same clothes day in and day out, until they practically fused to our skin. I scratched myself raw some nights. Others just lay there, backs split open in sores so deep you'd swear a plow had gone through them. John Billings wrote in Hardtack and Coffee about how filthy we were, and he didn't exaggerate a word. Our uniforms stiffened with sweat and grease, and still we wore them. What else could we do? There were no spares, no basins, no soap. Just us, our filth, and the scratching. And the lice, God, the lice. They were everywhere. We used to joke that they were our constant companions. I remember gathering around the fire with the others for what we called shirt reading. We'd peel off our shirts, turn them inside out, and pick through the seams, looking for parasites, flicking them into the fire one by one. All the while, we'd gossip about home or the officers or anything to take our minds off the crawling itch in our sleeves. Private Sam Watkins. I remember him saying the lice were the size of corn kernels. He called them graybacks and named them after our commanding officers. It wasn't far off. Those bugs were the true generals of the camp, always in command, always in every pocket and fold. We fought battles during the day. At night, we fought our own skin. I remember reading a letter from a fellow Union soldier who joked, if the lice were uniform in size and well-drilled, they could pull a man out of the trenches. I laughed when I first read it, not because it was funny, but because it was true. At Andersonville, it was worse. The scratching never stopped. Even in the dead of night, when the moaning and crying had finally gone quiet, you could still hear it, the constant, desperate scraping of fingernails against filthy skin. But it wasn't just soldiers who suffered. Back home, folks weren't faring much better. In Richmond, the Tredegar Iron Works kept running through the worst of it. They had to, it was our main foundry. But I heard from one of the boys who worked there that the men were collapsing at their stations from hunger. He told me men faint at their posts, but we dare not stop the machines. The war wouldn't wait for food or mercy. We had to keep the gears turning, even if it meant grinding ourselves into the dust. Out in the countryside, survival took darker turns. I met a woman outside Petersburg who showed me how they made what she called bark bread, a sad splintery mix of tree bark, cornmeal dust, and water. They'd boil it down with whatever scraps of dried sweet potato they could find to make something like coffee, though it tasted more like burnt dirt than anything else. People were starving and still trying to keep dignity. But when you're boiling wood for supper, there's not much left to pretend. I met folks who boiled their belts for supper. Martha Ballard, her husband, owned a plantation before the war stripped. Everything Bear told me once that her family had lived for weeks on a broth made from boiled leather. Belts, boot tops, harness straps, whatever they could soften in a pot. We pretend it is beef broth, she said with a faint smile. But we fool no one, least of all our stomachs. She wasn't the only one. I knew dozens who did the same. Hunger has a way of peeling the pride right off you layer by layer until you're gnawing on things you once strapped across your chest. But even for those who managed to eat disease still waited in the shadows. After the war, I passed through Memphis and saw the aftermath of the cholera outbreak. Hundreds dead, and not from guns or bayonets, but from filth. The city's waste systems had collapsed during the war, and they never recovered in time. The water ran black, the gutters overflowed, and the smell of sickness was thick in the streets. I still remember what Dr. Samuel Stout said. We defeated the Confederacy, but the filth and disease of war may yet defeat us all. He was right. We'd torn the country apart and salted its wounds, and the price kept rising in graves in silence, in the sickness that lingered long after the cannons had gone quiet. We won the war, maybe, but sometimes looking back, I wonder what exactly we lost to do it. Even after the guns went silent, the dying didn't stop. We came out of that war with bodies already broken and lungs already weak. And then tuberculosis moved in like it had been waiting. Camps for widows and refugees filled up with coughing shadows, whole families packed into crumbling rooms with no fresh air, no food, no hope. The war didn't end, it just changed shape. I remember reading Mary Chesnut's final diary entry from 1865. She wrote about how the fear kept changing, first the Yankees, then the freedmen, then starvation, and finally extermination. That word hit me hard. Extermination. Like we weren't even people anymore, just leftovers to be swept aside. And she wasn't wrong. I saw it with my own eyes. Towns that once held parades now held silence. Children with eyes too old for their faces. Men too thin to cast a shadow. The South wasn't just beaten, it was hollowed out, emptied. Federal Surgeon Charles Black said it plain. The people here are not just defeated, they are decimated. He was right. I walked through villages where the only movement was the wind blowing dust through abandoned doors. Peace didn't heal us. It exposed just how deep the wounds had gone. I used to think bullets were the worst of it. That once the gunfire ended, we'd be safe, that we could start over. But it wasn't bullets that broke us. It was what came after. Disease, hunger, and the kind of despair that settles into your bones like winter. The war burned more than fields. It burned the air, the water, the very health out of our soil and our people. I've seen it. Children born years after the surrender, still with sunken cheeks and twisted limbs, mothers dying in childbirth from infections. No one could treat old men coughing up blood into rags because there were no doctors left to help them. We thought we'd seen the worst of it during the fighting, but we were wrong. Years passed and still the land refused to forget. Crops failed where armies had camped. Wells turned sour. Families passed down more than grief, they passed down the consequences, the quiet, invisible scars. Frederick Law Olmsted, he worked with the Sanitary Commission, called it America's first modern public health catastrophe. And he was right. This war wasn't just a clash of armies. It was the ruin of rivers, the poisoning of wells, the destruction of systems we didn't even know we depended on until they were gone. We didn't just bleed in the fields. We bled for decades after in ways the world never tallied. We learned too late and at too high a price that you don't need a battlefield to destroy an army. You just have to let disease do the work, or hunger, or the slow rot of contaminated earth and stagnant water. What we once ignored, the health of our people, the condition of our land, turned out to be as deadly as any enemy's bullet. I saw firsthand how that knowledge changed things. Doctors who had never cared for sanitation before suddenly spoke of latrines and clean water like they were sacred. Officers began planning around disease, not just muskets. The war rewrote the rules not just of combat, but of survival. But if you want to see the worst of what we endured, you don't have to look to the fields. Look to the prison camps. That's where hell truly lived. I've been in one. I've seen what men become when food disappears and walls close in. Confederate Secretary Seddon once said it was a harsh necessity of war that prisoners must suffer. I doubt he ever spent a single night among the dying. The battlefield could kill you quick, a shot, a stab, a blast. But the camps, they killed slow, with filth, with fever, with hunger so deep it gnawed at your sanity. I watched men waste away to nothing, their ribs jutting like fence posts, their skin too thin to hold back the stink of death. Surviving meant becoming something else entirely, something leaner, harder, colder. The prison didn't just hold us, it changed us. Andersonville, even saying the name out loud, still gives me a chill. Camp Sumter was what they officially called it, but none of us used that name. To us, it was simply the pit, the grave, hell without fire. I was there. I breathed its foul air, slept in its mud, watched men wither into skeletons before my eyes. It was built for 10,000 of us. By the summer of '64, they shoved in over 32,000. No shelter, no drainage, no mercy. Just acres of filth and misery penned in by pine logs and desperation. Men died every day, 100 a day, sometimes more. You could see it in their eyes before their bodies gave out. They'd go quiet, still. You'd wake up in the morning and realize the man beside you had stopped breathing in the night. And you'd step over him like he was a sack of grain, because if you didn't, you might fall too. I remember Dorrance Atwater, a boy, really quiet, serious. He worked in the hospital, if you could call it that. He kept a secret list of the dead, writing down names behind his back, while pretending to follow orders. Risked his neck to keep us from disappearing completely. That list would matter one day after the war, when justice finally caught up with the man who ran that place. Captain Wirtz, Swiss-born, cold-hearted. They hanged him after the war, said it was for war crimes. I say it was for letting so many of us die when he could have done something, anything to stop it. But Andersonville wasn't about one man. It was about all of us trapped inside that rotting pen, trying to survive just one more night in a place that didn't believe in mornings. I'll never forget what Dr. Joseph Jones said when he came to inspect our camp. He was a Confederate surgeon, and even he looked sick when he saw us. I found the prisoners in all stages of suffering and disease, he wrote. That was putting it mildly. We weren't men anymore, just sacks of bones lying in our own filth, too weak to crawl, too starved to speak. The stronger ones pissed where they stood. The rest just let it happen. Dignity had long since rotted away, but nothing summed up Andersonville like the deadline. It was just a rail, a simple wooden rail, about 19 feet inside the walls. That line marked your cage. Step over it even by accident and the guards had orders to shoot. And they did. No warning, no mercy. I saw it happen again and again. Some poor soul, dazed from fever or trying to stretch his legs, would step too close. Crack. Down he went. Sometimes the guards aimed to maim, other times they went straight for the head. I remember one of them, James Duncan, I think his name was. He bragged he'd shot 31 Yankees in a single month. Said it like he was talking about bagging ducks. But the worst part, some of the men chose to cross it. They'd stagger forward with empty eyes, their feet dragging, their hands trembling, and they'd step over that rail like they were walking into the arms of God. I knew what they were thinking. We all did. A bullet was a better end than the slow drowning of starvation and filth. It was their way out. In that place, dying quickly felt like the only control we had left. I watched 3 men die at the deadline one morning, not by accident, but by choice. They walked slow, shoulders, straight eyes ahead. They didn't run. They didn't cry out. They just crossed that cursed rail like they were stepping into church. The guards cut them down without a word and then walked away. Left the bodies there to bloat in the sun. Sergeant William Corbett saw it too. He wrote in his diary, "They were shot down like dogs. I couldn't have said it better. And they left them where they fell, rotting at the edge of the living. I've seen dogs buried better." That week in July '64, the guards burned through more than 200 rounds on men who stepped too close. Some were desperate. Some just too delirious to notice. But the result was always the same blood on the dust silence from the watchtowers. And then there was the stream. They called it Sweetwater Branch, though there wasn't a drop of sweetness in it. That trickle of water ran straight through the center of the prison. It was where we drank, where we bathed, where we relieved ourselves. Sergeant Sherman called it a ribbon of human excrement. He was right. That stream carried everything: filth, disease, death, and still we crowded around it like animals. We had no choice. We called it the bowel complaint. Dysentery, diarrhea, whatever name you gave it. It emptied you until you were hollow and left you moaning in your own waste. I remember John Ransom saying it was full of maggots. I fought a man once, weak as I was, just to get a scoop of that water. We all did. You fight for filth when you're dying of thirst. You drink death because it's the only thing left. Dr. John Bates once said, "A third of the deaths at Andersonville came from that stream alone." I believe him. I saw it, that poison ribbon winding through the camp, dragging us down one drink at a time. But Andersonville wasn't the only hell on this earth. I met boys who came out of northern camps and their eyes told the same stories mine did. Camp Douglas up in Chicago, they called it the North's Andersonville. It wasn't just the cold that got them. It was the rats, the filth, the freezing mud floors. They crammed men underground during the worst of the Midwest winters. Some nights they'd sleep on stone, their breath hanging in the air like smoke, their skin blistered raw from the frost. The rats didn't even run anymore. They strutted. At Point Lookout in Maryland, where over 50,000 of us passed through, we found no mercy. Word had spread about how Union prisoners were suffering down south, and they wanted to make us pay for it. Rations were cut deliberately, punishment, they said. Retaliation. As if any of us had a say in how our officers ran a camp hundreds of miles away. I remember the long nights, stomach growling like a dog ribs pressing against my own skin. Some guards shot into our tents just to watch us scatter. Lieutenant Park wrote about it, how they treated it like sport. The Yankee guards amused themselves, he said, by shooting into our tents at night. It was true. I saw men wounded in their sleep, not in battle, but by laughter and lead from the men meant to guard them. Prisoners or not, we were still human. But by then, we'd all been stripped of even that. I wrote home once and told them, "We are fed like hogs and treated like dogs." And I meant every word. At Point Lookout, they let us waste away, and the winter of '64 was especially cruel. Captain Jones said the death rate hit 28% that season. I didn't need a statistic, I saw the bodies pile up myself. But even worse than the hunger was the way they used it against us. At Elmira, or Helmira as we called it, they didn't just starve us, they mocked us with food. I saw guards walk past our fences carrying loaves of bread fresh and hot, the smell dragging through the air like a cruel joke. Sometimes they'd hold it just out of reach, toss crumbs just far enough to make us scramble. Men fought over scraps like animals. Not because we were savages, but because we were starving. Colonel Tracy ran that place. He said it was discipline, said we needed to be humbled. I wonder what kind of man looks into the eyes of the dying and calls it training. Private Trumbull put it best, they fed us like beasts in a cage, throwing food into the yard like we were in a zoo. I saw men crawl across the ground just to grab a crust before someone else snatched it. Others wept when they didn't get any. Some just stopped trying, just sat there silent as the bread landed inches away. That's what starvation does. It breaks more than your body, it strips your dignity down to the bone. At Elmira, men died by the hundreds. The cold alone could kill you, but more often it was a slow bleed of hunger and filth. They say the death rate reached 24% there, nearly as bad as Andersonville. I didn't need the number to know the truth. I saw it in every sunken face, every pair of hands too weak to hold a spoon. One day, I watched a man trade his gold wedding ring, the only thing he had left of home, for a piece of moldy cornbread. He didn't hesitate, just handed it over and swallowed that green crust like it was salvation. That's what starvation did. It made you give away your memories for one more breath. And then there were darker things. Back in Andersonville, whispers spread like smoke. Men were disappearing, not escaping, just gone. And then someone found what was left of one of them in the swamp behind the stockade. only half a body. Half. I remember Sergeant Major Kellogg, he saw it too. A man's remains torn and scattered. We didn't talk about it out loud, not really. But we all knew, or at least feared. There was a gang in the camp called themselves the Raiders. They beat and robbed the weak. But some of us began to believe they'd gone even further. That when hunger got too sharp, they'd done the unthinkable. We never proved it. But when you're starving to death in a cage, you learn that hell has no floor. John McElroy wrote about our time in Andersonville, but he didn't say everything. He hinted at it, whispered around the truth, said some things were too horrible to commit to paper. I understand why. There are things I still can't bring myself to say even now. But I saw what I saw. There was a guard, James Barrett, who once said he found bones in the woods behind the stockade. Human bones, with teeth marks. The officers dismissed it, called it madness, blamed the fevered imaginations of starving men. But we knew. We'd seen too much to doubt it. Hunger turns men into something else. And when that line is crossed, when the rules break, you don't come back the same. Not that many had a chance to escape. We tried. God knows we tried. But most who ran never made it far. At Salisbury Prison down in North Carolina, they had dogs, not just any dogs, but trained bloodhounds. Mean beasts that lived for the hunt. I heard the name John H. Sears, their handler, a dozen times. He said his hounds could smell a Yankee a mile away. We believed him. I still remember the sound of those dogs' howls in the distance, growing closer, and the fear it put in men's eyes. Some would freeze too afraid to take another step. Others ran anyway, even knowing what was coming. Desperation does that. It whispers louder than reason. Those dogs. Once you heard them, you didn't forget it. That baying, deep and cruel, echoing through the trees like something from a nightmare. They didn't need to bite you. Just hearing them was enough to send half the camp scrambling back behind the fence like whipped dogs. At Florence Stockade in South Carolina, I remember a guard, James Connor, kept track of how many tried to escape. 328 in 1 month. Only 2 made it. 2. I saw what happened to the ones who got caught. At Belle Isle in Virginia, they didn't just drag you back. They made an example of you, tied you to a post, hands behind your back chest, bare to the sky, and left you there. Didn't matter if it was raining or snowing, or the sun was burning your skin off. You stood there until you passed out, or worse. One January night in '64, I watched a boy freeze to death that way. He couldn't have been more than 19. They tied him up tight, and we watched him shake through the first night. By the second morning, he wasn't shaking anymore. Lieutenant Carrington was there too. He wrote it down in his journal, called it punishment. I called it slow murder. We all knew the risk when we tried to run. But staying wasn't life either. It was just waiting for death to catch up. As the war dragged on, the punishments for trying to escape grew darker, more twisted. They weren't content just to catch you. They had to make you suffer, make you an example. At Camp Lawton in Georgia, they had a special punishment. They called it the running gauntlet. I saw it once. God help me, I wish I hadn't. They lined up the guards in 2 rows, shoulder to shoulder, each man holding a rifle or a bayonet or a stick. Then they shoved the prisoner, usually barefoot, shirtless, already half dead, and made him run through. You didn't run, though. You stumbled, ducked, bled your way through while the guards slammed their weapons into your back, your head, your ribs. It was less a punishment and more a ritual. I'll never forget this boy from Ohio. Just a kid. They made him run it 3 times. He didn't make it past the second. By the end, he was coughing blood and couldn't even crawl. Lieutenant Ripple wrote it down, said the boy died with his eyes open. At Camp Ford in Texas, they had something different, sweat boxes. Little wooden coffins barely big enough to kneel in. They'd throw you in, bolt the door, and leave you to bake under the Texas sun for days. No water, no air, just heat and silence. You could hear the men inside whimpering like children. That was the war too, not just bullets and banners. It was wood nails and screams behind closed boxes. The war may have ended, but the prison never really let us go. I made it home, if you could call it that. My body walked through the door, thin as a scarecrow skin, stretched tight, eyes sunken deep. But something in me had stayed behind, back in the mud and fences. The wounds scabbed over, sure, but the damage went deeper than skin. We were ghosts. All of us who survived those camps. I remember Abram Ryan, a fellow veteran, said we were the living dead, walking shadows of men. He was right. Even that might have been too kind. Some of us couldn't sleep. Others screamed in the night. I saw good men flinch at the creak of a door or the smell of wet earth. Some started talking to people who weren't there. Others didn't talk at all. They didn't have a name for it back then, not like they do now. But we know what it was. The war kept living inside us. In the years that followed, I heard about more than a few who ended it. Quietly. A rope in a barn. A pistol behind the shed. You'd hear whispers in town he never came back, right? He couldn't shake the fever dreams, he was never really here. Some folks say we were lucky to survive. But some days I wasn't so sure. Those camps didn't just hold us, they unmade us. They stripped us down to raw nerve and bone until all that was left was the question, will I survive? And if I do, what will I be on the other side? The war wasn't just muskets and cannons and battles in open fields. No, it was the grind of hunger, the stench of rot, the weight of silence. It was the long nights staring at the stars through prison bars, wondering if anyone would remember your name. It was enduring day after day when part of you wanted to just lie down and let go. I survived. Many didn't. And even now I carry it. In my bones, in my dreams, in the way I sometimes freeze in the middle of a quiet room, certain I've heard the baying of dogs or the crack of a rifle. I look in the mirror and sometimes see a face that still belongs behind the stockade wall. Thomas Mann once wrote, "I survived the war, but the war did not leave me. It waits in dreams, it waits in quiet rooms, and sometimes it waits in my own reflection." He spoke for all of us. We may have lived through the prison, but we never truly escaped it.